So today's episode is going to be talking about rules for fat fortifying food. Why is that important? Well, let's start at the beginning. How much alcohol should an alcoholic drink? Duh, that's pretty obvious. 0. Is it okay just to use heroin on Tuesdays? Hell no. So addiction is managed through abstinence. And the first rule of this segment is the goal for carbohydrates is 0. There should never, ever, ever, ever be an allowance for carbohydrates in your diet. The allowance is 0. There should never be an allowance for alcohol in an alcoholic's life. And it is critically important in the carbohydrate addiction model that you understand the allowance for carbohydrates is 0. Because as soon as you have an allowance, you convert an addiction model to a harm reduction model. You can have a little bit, but not a lot, and you cannot break a habit if you're still doing it. Oh, but Doc, there's carbohydrate. Yes, there are carbohydrates incidentally in certain foods. But the intentional goal is 0. Yes, there are incidental carbohydrates in certain foods. If I drink a Gatorade Zero, there's 1 gram of carbohydrate. So yes, I want to understand and I want to know where my incidentals are. And the incidentals should never be above 30 grams of total carbohydrates per day. But the 30 grams is not an up to. It's not an up to. Okay? The 30 grams is not an allowance. It's only to calculate incidentals, but I never want you to give yourself intentionally permission to eat carbohydrates, because that's the way you destroy what you're trying to do, which is break an addiction. Oh, and by the way, vegetables are free. I'm not going to discuss that in detail. Go back to my rules for eating vegetables segment. Vegetables are free. We do not count the carbohydrates in vegetables. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but here's the focus. If you're not eating carbohydrates, you want to be eating fat and protein as your primary fuel sources. The problem is that, number one, protein gets very readily turned by the liver into fat. Gluconeogenesis turns amino acids into into sugar. Gluconeogenesis is about turning amino acids and glycerol into sugar. And you don't want that, because that then triggers the insulin cycle. So you don't want that. What you want to do is to protect the protein that you do eat with fat. And ideally, about 60 to 70% of your diet should be fat, preferably saturated but mixed fats. And they should be natural fats, not oils that were heated out of things like Crisco that's actually a lubricant for engines. You want to eat naturally occurring fats, whether they come from animals or plants, preferably animals. So what eating fat does is it gets you to burn fat as a fuel source. But one of the idiotic principles of the ketogenic diet is that it's okay to eat as much fat as you want to and fat load. You drink fat in your coffee, you add MCT oil in it. Yeah, eating fat will get you into ketosis. But eating a ton of fat, while it may be restricted by your body meal to meal, if you're eating a ton of fat, it's still calories you're consuming, and to a certain extent it defies weight loss. The role of eating fat is, number one, to protect the protein from becoming a source of energy. Fat protects protein so that protein can go to where it's supposed to be used as a nutrient for muscles, for tissue repair, as an enzyme, as a hormone. That's the first thing. The second thing is that what eating a decent amount of fat does is it prevents an insulin response. You don't want an insulin response. You want your insulin to be super low even during a meal. And if you're eating some fat, not a huge amount, but regulated by your body, if you're eating fat, it keeps the insulin low, and then when you've used or stored that fat that you've eaten, there's a seamless transition between the fat that you've eaten and the fat in your own body. And the longer you can use the fat in your body because you're not eating, intermittent fasting, the more weight you lose. So we leverage ketosis as a way to provide satiety and as a way to induce fat utilization as a fuel source rather than protein or carbohydrates. And then you're using a super low amount of carbohydrates for what's absolutely necessary. You're using amino acids to feed that, but it's a trivial amount. I've only got about 5 grams of carbohydrates in my entire bloodstream right now. That's less than 1 level teaspoon. And that's because I'm in ketosis. If I was using sugar, I'd be using a ton of it. So I want to be in ketosis. But the other important thing about ketosis is when you eat fat, as you'll see in the segment before this, what eating fat does is it stops you on a chemical basis from overeating. So when you eat fat, especially soluble fat, that fat goes into your bloodstream very quickly, triggers chemicals, triggers hormones from your intestine, triggers leptin from your fat cells, and the feedback to your brain says, dude, you're full, you're feeling queasy, stop eating. And it restricts how much you eat. And if you eat less, and yet you can seamlessly access your own fat, guess what you're doing? You're losing weight, but you're doing it from the perspective of feeling full, not feeling hungry. So adding fat to your food, fat fortifying your food, induces ketosis, keeps you in ketosis, activates the leptinoid release, which gives you early and prolonged satiety, so that structural techniques like eating sequentially and intermittent fasting become comfortable and possible. And if you put all of that together, if you fat fortify your food, and I'll talk in a minute about the practical aspects of that, it allows you to eat a small amount and be full, and it allows you to stay full for a long period of time without eating, and that's where weight loss comes from, and that's sustainable weight loss. So fat fortifying your food allows you to feel full very quickly, eat sequentially, and allows intermittent fasting to be not an obligation, but just something that you do automatically. That's how they integrate. They're not separate components. They're all integrated. So how do you fat fortify? Well, first of all, I'd like the star of your plate, if you possibly can, to be some animal product. Whether it's eggs or cheese or meat or birds or fish or seafood, I don't mind. But that inherently will come with a source of fat, and the other key thing is there's really no carbohydrates in any animal products. But particularly here in America, we've cut the fat out. So there are certain soluble elements that we can add to our food to increase the fat content. The soluble elements are butter, lard, tallow, which are different forms of animal fat, liquid animal fat, mayo, high-fat mayo, olive oil, coconut oil, and avocado oil, the pressed oils, the oils that get pressed from those particular food products. Even though they are not animal products, they are very high in either saturated or monounsaturated fats, and they're healthy fats. So that's the way, and you can add those to anything you're eating, whether you're eating vegetables or carnivorous food. I'll often fry my steak in olive oil. I'll do my chicken wings in olive oil or coconut oil. There's ways to increase the fat content with those soluble fats. And remember, the soluble fats enter the bloodstream very quickly and activate the leptinoid response, the satiety response, very early into a meal before you've eaten a huge amount of food to feel stuffed. So the soluble fats, again, butter, tallow, lard, olive, coconut, avocado oil, mayo. The solid fat fortifiers are cheese, bacon, eggs, avocado, pork rinds. There are others, but if you have access to those, and when you cook a meal, when you put a meal in front of you or in the middle of the table and you're eating sequentially, if you fat fortify each bite, you're activating the satiety system, you're activating the leptinoid system, you're going to eat far less and yet be full. And that is the mechanism of vicarious rather than intentional caloric reduction that is sustainable lifelong, as long as you remove the emotional parts from that. So fat fortify your food with liquid or solid bits of fat, but don't put fat in what you drink. Don't put fat in what you drink. These bullet coffees, these MCT oils, these artificial things, don't use that. Use what occurs in nature. And that is a sustainable way of living. I can look at a piece of food and always add some fat to it. I usually have olive oil on my table. Fat fortify your food. It induces the ability to eat much smaller amounts because you're eating to chemical satiety, not fullness satiety, and it prolongs intermittent fasting easily without being intentional. You put all of that together, that is a ketogenic lifestyle. And then all you have to do is, not all you have to do, but an important part of this is to find ways to deal with your emotional needs through what you do, not what you consume. And if that becomes the rest of your life, you will not be fat and sick based on what you eat. I hope that helps. I hope it resonates.